Tonight, the defensive geography of the Israeli military has been operationally redrawn across a breadth and simultaneity that no previous engagement in the theater has approached. What unfolded across the 320 military installations, radar complexes, command nodes, airbase infrastructure, and logistics facilities of the IDF in the hours before dawn was not a concentrated strike against a single theater of operations. It was the systematic disabling of the military nervous system of an entire state, executed by a precision-guided missile barrage whose geographic distribution, target category diversity, and sequencing logic reflected years of Iranian analytical investment in the specific problem of collapsing Israeli military operational coherence across every domain simultaneously, rather than degrading it incrementally in any single one. 1,500 precision-guided missiles. Not the volume that saturation doctrine employs to overwhelm defensive systems through sheer numerical excess, but the precisely calculated quantity that Iranian strike planners had determined through years of studying the specific infrastructure, the operational dependencies, and the defensive coverage geometry of 320 Israeli military sites, would produce comprehensive disablement across every targeted installation when each missile was assigned to a specific aim point whose destruction would remove a specific operational function from the Israeli military system. The distinction matters because it defines the operational philosophy that produced this engagement. Saturation seeks to overwhelm through volume. Precision seeks to disable through accuracy. What Iran executed last night was the combination of sufficient volume to defeat the defensive architecture and sufficient precision to ensure that every missile reaching its target produced the specific functional destruction the targeting plan required. The Israeli military infrastructure targeted across the engagement represents the physical foundation of IDF operational capability across every domain. The radar installations that provide the detection coverage without which air defense systems are operationally blind. The communications relay infrastructure that connects command nodes to the units they direct. The airbase complexes whose runway systems, fuel storage, and maintenance infrastructure determine the sortie rate that Israeli air power can sustain. The command facilities whose function coordinates the simultaneous management of multiple threat axes. The ammunition and fuel supply infrastructure whose depletion timeline governs how long any military operation can be sustained, regardless of the tactical competence of the forces executing it. 320 sites whose combined operational function constitutes the enabling layer without which every other IDF capability becomes a collection of platforms and personnel that cannot be effectively employed. The shock inside the Israeli military establishment is not the shock of having lost equipment or sustained casualties in combat. It is the shock of discovering that the operational infrastructure that makes the IDF function as a coherent military institution, rather than an aggregation of individual assets, has been disabled across 320 points simultaneously, and that the disablement has been executed with a precision that suggests the adversary understood the Israeli military system with the depth of an institution that had been studying it for years, at a level of analytical detail that the Israeli counterintelligence assessment had not adequately acknowledged. The Israeli integrated air defense architecture, covering the 320 targeted sites, performed with the engagement discipline its doctrine required. Iron Dome batteries engaged the incoming precision-guided missiles with their Tamir interceptors at the intercept rates the system is designed to sustain. David's sling systems address the medium-range threats within their engagement envelopes. The Arrow systems, operating against the ballistic components of the barrage, expended their interceptor inventories at rates the engagement tempo demanded. The combined performance of these systems against 1,500 incoming missiles produced intercept ratios that represented competent defensive operation under extraordinarily demanding conditions. The problem was not defensive incompetence. The problem was the specific mathematical relationship between 1,500 incoming missiles, the combined interceptor inventory of the defensive systems covering 320 distributed sites across the full geographic breadth of Israeli military basing, and the magazine depth that each defensive battery could bring to bear against the portion of the incoming volume directed at the sites within its coverage radius. Iranian strike planners had reconstructed this mathematical relationship with the analytical depth that the operational objective required. The critical variable was not the total interceptor inventory of the Israeli defensive architecture in aggregate. It was the specific interceptor inventory available to defend each individual site. Because a defensive system covering 320 distributed targets cannot concentrate its full magazine depth against the threats arriving at any single target without leaving other targets undefended. The 1,500 missiles were not distributed randomly across the 320 sites. They were allocated in quantities calculated against the specific defensive coverage of each site, ensuring that the missiles directed at each installation arrived in volumes exceeding the interceptor capacity of the batteries providing that installation's specific defensive coverage. The first wave, approximately 400 missiles, was directed against the detection and coordination infrastructure. The radar installations covering the approach corridors from the east and northeast, the over-the-horizon radar systems providing extended early warning coverage, the data fusion nodes that integrate the outputs of the distributed sensor network into the unified air picture that the National Air Defense Command requires to direct its defensive response. By opening the engagement against the detection layer, the Iranian operation immediately began compressing the information environment within which the Israeli defensive response was being managed. Air defense systems operating on a degraded common air picture cannot coordinate their engagement geometry with the precision that layered defense requires. The detection coverage gaps created by the first wave's destruction of radar infrastructure became the approach corridors through which the subsequent waves were routed, ensuring that the missiles directed at the highest priority targets in the later waves were approaching along axes whose coverage had been specifically removed in the opening minutes of the engagement. The second wave, approximately 500 missiles, targeted the airbase infrastructure across the full geographic distribution of Israeli air power basing. Not the aircraft themselves, which dispersion procedures and hardened shelters partially protect, but the enabling infrastructure whose destruction removes the operational utility of whatever aircraft survive. Runway systems struck at multiple points along their operational length, with the penetrating warheads whose design was optimized against reinforced concrete airfield construction. Fuel storage and distribution infrastructure struck with incendiary warheads, whose effect on aviation fuel storage produces fires that runway repair teams cannot address until the fires have been controlled, extending the operational downtime beyond what the physical runway damage alone would require. Air traffic control and base operations infrastructure struck with precision that removed the coordination capacity required to execute flight operations, even if the runways themselves could be rapidly repaired. An air force whose aircraft are undamaged but whose bases cannot support flight operations is not an operational air force. It is a collection of grounded aircraft waiting for infrastructure that no longer functions. The third wave, approximately 350 missiles, addressed the command and communications infrastructure across the full depth of Israeli military organization. The IDF operates through a command architecture whose function depends on continuous information flow between the national command level, the theater command level, the divisional level, and the unit level. Disrupting that flow at multiple points simultaneously does not merely reduce the efficiency of command. It removes the situational awareness and the coordination capacity that allows units to function as components of a coherent military effort, rather than isolated elements executing whatever local responses their immediate circumstances suggest. The communications relay stations struck in the third wave were not selected because their individual destruction would be decisive. They were selected because their combined destruction would produce the command isolation effect across the full IDF organizational architecture that the operational objective required. The fourth wave, approximately 250 missiles, targeted the logistics and maintenance infrastructure whose depletion timeline governs the operational sustainability of every other IDF capability. Ammunition supply points struck with warheads whose effect against stored munitions produces the secondary explosions that extend the destruction well beyond the physical footprint of the initial impact. Fuel storage infrastructure struck with the incendiary warhead variants optimized against petroleum storage, whose fires burn beyond the capacity of base firefighting resources to control in the operational time frame relevant to the engagement's immediate consequences. Maintenance facilities struck with a precision that disables the repair capacity for armored vehicles and aircraft, converting every piece of equipment that sustains mechanical damage in the coming operational period from a temporarily degraded asset into a permanently inoperable one. The precision-guided missile capability underlying the operational achievement of last night's engagement reflects an Iranian weapons development trajectory whose evolution Western assessments have consistently evaluated against the wrong benchmark. The benchmark applied was whether Iranian precision-guided missiles could match the accuracy of American or Israeli precision munitions. The relevant benchmark was whether Iranian precision-guided missiles could achieve the accuracy required to produce the specific functional destruction of hardened military infrastructure that the Iranian operational doctrine required them to produce. Against that benchmark, the Fateh 110 series, the Zulfiqar, and the Khaibar-Shikan variants fitted with the guidance packages Iran has progressively refined across years of development and operational employment, have achieved the performance the doctrine required, and the 320 disabled installations of this morning's assessment are the operational confirmation of that achievement. The development of guidance systems precise enough to reliably disable specific functional components of hardened military infrastructure required the sustained investment of Iranian engineering resources over a time frame measured in decades rather than years. Every international agreement that sought to limit Iranian access to precision guidance technology instead generated the Indigenous Development Program that removed the external dependency the agreement had targeted. The precision that produced 320 disabled installations last night was not acquired through technology transfer or foreign assistance in its current form. It was built through the patient accumulation of domestic engineering capability that sanctions pressure paradoxically incentivized Iran to develop rather than purchase. In the hours following the confirmation of 320 military sites disabled across the full geographic and functional breadth of IDF infrastructure, the Israeli government confronted a strategic situation whose internal logic differed fundamentally from the aftermath of any previous engagement. Previous Iranian strikes had damaged Israeli military capability at the equipment and unit level. Last night's engagement disabled it at the infrastructure level, the layer whose restoration is prerequisite to the operational employment of the units and equipment that survived the barrage. The IDF retains personnel. It retains surviving equipment. What it does not retain across the 320 sites whose operational function was the target of 1,500 precision-guided missiles is the infrastructure required to translate that personnel and equipment into a coherent military operation. The options available to the Israeli political and military leadership in those hours were constrained by the operational reality the engagement had created. Retaliation at the scale the disablement of 320 military sites would conventionally demand requires the operational infrastructure to plan, coordinate, and execute that retaliation. And precisely that infrastructure had been the target of the engagement. Airstrikes require bases that can support flight operations. Ground operations require command systems that can direct them. Naval operations require communications infrastructure that can coordinate them. The engagement had been designed to disable the enabling layer that every retaliatory option depended upon, and it had been designed with sufficient precision to achieve that disablement across 320 sites in a single engagement. Allied capitals received the morning's assessment of 320 disabled Israeli military installations, with the specific concern of governments whose own security arrangements rest on assumptions about IDF operational capability that the engagement has qualified. Washington is assessing what the disablement of IDF operational infrastructure means for the regional military balance at a moment when American assets in the theater are themselves operating under the shadow of demonstrated Iranian strike capability across multiple platform categories. The Gulf capitals are conducting the same assessment against their own security calculations, and the direction of the conclusions those assessments are producing is visible in the diplomatic traffic even before formal positions have been announced. The installations across 320 Israeli military sites are quieter now than they were during the hours the missiles were arriving. The damage assessment is being conducted by whatever personnel and whatever operational capacity the engagement has left available to conduct it. In a military theater where 1,500 Iranian precision-guided missiles can disable 320 military sites in a single coordinated engagement and overwhelm the air defense architecture designed to prevent exactly that outcome, what does military operational readiness actually require? What does infrastructure resilience actually mean? Who builds it? And on what foundations can it rest when the foundations that existed last night have been disabled before the sun has risen? Iran has provided its answer across decades of precision guidance development and validated that answer in a single pre-dawn engagement. The rest of the region is still formulating its response, and the shape of that response will determine the character of the regional military balance for the generation to come.